Mr. Price, when we talk about investments in emerging markets, people always tend to think about the BRICS, but which other countries are interesting for investments?
Well, I've been investing for more than 5 years now in a region called Emerging Europe, Middle East, Africa. And I think what you see is a lot of money going into the BRICS countries because they've received so much publicity. So a lot of money going to China, India, Brazil, Russia, etc. But not as much money going into places like Africa, not as much money going into the Middle East as well. So I think there's some real opportunities there which are off investors' radar screens.
And when we talk about Middle East, for instance, which sectors are interesting? Which type of companies should we look at? What do you look at?
Well, I always prefer to invest in the consumer-related companies. Now, unfortunately, when you look at the Middle East in particular, there are not so many listed consumer-related companies. So you really have to look at the banks. And there it's a difficult process because you've had this enormous property bubble in the Middle East, which you're trying to work your way through. So the banks are very cheap, but they also have a book of property which is, in some cases, questionable. So there are some opportunities in the banks in the Middle East, but really it's one you have to be very careful at in terms of looking through from investing perspective. And then the broad-based consumer-related companies are very difficult to find in a listed equity vehicle, which is what I invest in.
And how is the liquidity of these markets?
The markets have picked up a lot in terms of liquidity if you look over the last 5 years. If you consider Egypt, which is North Africa or Middle East, this is a country with 70 million people, an enormous opportunity in certain areas. So a company that I like is Gabor Auto, which is the Hyundai distributor in Egypt and Iraq. A lot of growth potential and trading at quite a cheap PE multiple. So that's the sort of company I like, but it's very difficult to find a lot of those companies. Another example would be Eastern Tobacco, which is the tobacco monopoly in Egypt. That's another cheap business, trading on about 7 times earnings, which has a lot of growth, particularly in pricing in Egypt.
And you invest in Africa as well, which sounds very exciting. How do you look at those normally called frontier markets? Isn't it a lot riskier than investing in BRICS or Middle East?
It's definitely riskier in terms of if you look at some of the political makeup of these economies. But really, Africa is a region which is growing. Africa is a region which is growing over 5% GDP real, whereas Europe is probably down at the 1% level, so 5 times quicker than Europe. Enormous population, closing on 1 billion people across Africa, and not as much competition. So Nigeria is a country I have quite a few investments in. I own Nigerian Breweries, which is a subsidiary of Heineken. I own Guinness Nigeria, which is a subsidiary of Diageo. I own some of the banks in Nigeria. These are cheap businesses with very, very good growth potential over the long term.
And can you mention a couple of other countries in Africa which is interesting?
Yes, so what you battle with is liquidity. But some of the other opportunities are, for example, I've invested in Standard Chartered Ghana. So it's a subsidiary of Standard Chartered Bank in Ghana, listed in Ghana. That's a business trading on about 5 times forward earnings multiple. Ghana is an economy which will grow dramatically. It's grown about 5 or 6% over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of real GDP growth. 2011, they start producing oil, and the economy will grow about 20% real GDP growth. That'll be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. That liquidity will get cycled through the banking sector, and the bank should do very well out of that. And there's a long-term growth opportunity there. I'm invested in places like Zambia. The world's largest new copper mine started up in Zambia through a business called Equinox. So there are a number of investments across Africa. I'm invested in oil companies in offshore Nigerian oil, where they have the opportunity to buy good value stakes in existing oil producing blocks. So there's a broad spectrum from banks to cigarettes to auto distributors, really across the spectrum to copper producers that I'm invested in.
And will there be a new BRIC country in Africa?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if I really want to see that, but the obvious example is Nigeria, which is, it's about 150, 160 million people in Nigeria. It's a country which is growing its GDP about 5 to 6%, and enormous potential to grow its GDP through productivity. So, for example, in Nigeria, if you owned a shop, you would need to have your own generator, electricity generator, because so few of the places in Nigeria have their own electricity. That's very expensive to burn diesel to generate your electricity. Slowly but surely, as electricity gets rolled out, there's enormous productivity and reduction in cost of doing business. Another example in Nigeria would be that 6 or 7 years ago, I don't know exactly, there were almost no mobile phone users in Nigeria. Today, there are more than 50 million mobile phone users. So there's enormous progress in these countries.